Ruth Delaney stood on the edge of her porch, the salty breeze from the Oregon coast tugging at her thin, gray hair. At 74, she wasn't the woman she used to be. The Pacific Ocean stretched out before her, a restless gray-green monster crashing against the rocky shore, its roar a soundtrack to her life for decades. She'd lived in this little seaside cottage in Newport since she was 30 back, when she was a third-grade teacher with a bounce in her step and a basket of warm oatmeal cookies for her students every Friday. Now, the porch boards creaked under her weight, and her hands gripped the railing tighter than they used to. Just getting old, she'd mutter to herself, a half-smile masking the ache in her chest. But deep down, Ruth knew it was more than that. Mornings used to be her favorite. She'd wake with the gulls, the sharp cry cutting through the fog, and head out for a walk along the beach. The sand would crunch under her sneakers, cool and damp, the air filling her lungs with that briny tang she loved. She'd wave at fishermen hauling crab pots, their shouts bouncing off the cliffs, and stop to pick up a smooth stone or a piece of sea glass for her classroom collection. Back then, her hair was thick and chestnut brown, her nails strong enough to pry open a stuck desk drawer, and her mind sharp enough to remember every kid's name, every parent's face, every lesson plan she'd scribbled in her spiral notebook. That Ruth felt invincible. This Ruth, she barely recognized herself. It started creeping in after she hit 70. The walks got shorter, 2 miles became 1, then half, then nothing. Her hair thinned until she could see her scalp in the bathroom mirror, a sight that made her flinch. Her nails turned brittle, snapping if she so much as bumped them against the counter. Her joints ached like they were full of wet sand, especially her knees, which groaned every time she climbed the 3 steps to her front door. And her memory? That was the worst. She'd forget where she parked her old Subaru, or the name of the librarian who'd been checking out her cozy mysteries for 15 years. Age catches us all, she'd say with a shrug, but it didn't feel like catching, it felt like drowning. That morning, Ruth stood there, staring at the waves, a mug of weak tea trembling in her hands. No cookies baking in the oven, no lesson plans to dream up. She hadn't baked in months, her fingers couldn't knead dough anymore, and the kids she used to spoil were grown, with kids of their own. She took a sip, the tea tasteless against the salt on her lips, and sighed. The wind whipped through her sweater, too thin for the chill, but she didn't go inside. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. Not just old age wrong, but a slow, quiet collapse she'd ignored too long. It hit her hardest a week ago. She'd decided to brave the beach again, her first walk in over a year. The tide was low, the sand packed hard and glistening, dotted with clumps of dark green kelp washed up from the deep. Ruth shuffled along, slower than she'd ever been, her breath shallow. She'd made it maybe 200 yards when her foot caught on a rock, or maybe it was nothing, just her own clumsiness. She stumbled, arms flailing, and went down. Not hard, not enough to break anything, but enough to send a jolt of panic through her. The sand was cold against her palms, the waves deafening in her ears. She sat there, stunned, as a seagull screeched overhead. A young jogger stopped, his dog panting at his side. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked, offering a hand. Ruth nodded, humiliated, and let him pull her up. "Fine, just fine," she lied, brushing sand off her jeans. But she wasn't fine. Her knee throbbed for hours after, a dull pulse that kept her awake. Her hands shook worse than usual, and when she looked in the mirror that night, she saw a stranger, pale, fragile, hollowed out. "What happened to me?" she whispered, tracing the lines on her face. She'd always thought 7'4" was just a number. She'd seen her own mother live to 90, spry and laughing, gardening till the end. But Ruth wasn't her mother. She was fading, and she didn't know why. The next day, she sat at her kitchen table, the same one where she'd grated papers and rolled out cookie dough, staring at a bowl of oatmeal she couldn't finish. Her stomach growled, but she had no appetite. Her hairbrush lay nearby, clogged with strands she'd pulled out that morning. She thought about calling her daughter, Ellen, but what would she say? "Hey, honey, your mom's falling apart?" No, She'd keep it to herself, like always. That's when she noticed it a flyer stuck under a magnet on the fridge, something about a local health fair. Superfoods for seniors, it read in big, cheerful letters. Ruth snorted. Superfoods. Right. Like kale's gonna fix this mess. But then she saw it. A little blurb about kelp. The ocean's secret weapon, it called it. Grew right there on her doorstep, washed up on her beach every day. She'd walked past it her whole life, slimy, smelly stuff she'd kick aside without a thought. The flyer said it was packed with nutrients, good for energy, bones, even memory. Ruth leaned back, skeptical but curious. Could something that simple have made a difference? She tossed the flyer aside, but it nagged at her. What if she'd known about it at 60, 50, even 72, before this slow slide got out of hand? She shook her head. Too late now, she muttered. Or was it? That night, she lay in bed, the sound of the waves seeping through the cracked window. She pictured herself at 72, still teaching part-time, still baking, still walking that beach like it was her own backyard. Where'd that woman go? She'd let the years slip by, chalking it all up to getting old, never questioning why she felt so bad, why her body and mind were giving up. Kelp couldn't turn back time, no magic wand could, but what if it held secrets she'd missed? What if she wasn't just a victim of age, but of ignorance? Ruth pulled the blanket tighter, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wasn't ready to quit, not yet. She thought of her students, the ones who'd hug her goodbye at the end of the year, the ones who'd squeal when she pulled cookies from her bag. She thought of Ellen, who'd begged her to visit more, and the grandkids she barely saw. She wasn't done living, but she was done waiting. I wish I'd known, she whispered into the dark. I wish I'd known before 72. And that's where it starts, this story of a woman who almost let it all go, until she stumbled onto something that might have saved her sooner. 4 kelp secrets, hiding in plain sight, right there on that Oregon shore. Secrets she's about to uncover, secrets that could have changed everything if she'd found them earlier. But here's the kicker. It's not just Ruth's story. It's yours too. Think about it, those little things you shrug off, the aches, the fog, the tiredness. What if there's something out there, something simple, you're missing? Something that could have made your 60s, your 70s, even your 80s feel alive again? Stick with me, because Ruth is about to find out what she wished she'd known, and it might just hit you right where you're sitting. So tell me, have you ever wondered what you should have known before it was too late? Ruth Delaney sat at her kitchen table, the flyer from the health fair crumpled in her hand. The Oregon wind howled outside, rattling the windows of her seaside cottage, but inside, it was quiet, too quiet. The faint smell of salt clung to everything, a reminder of the beach just beyond her door, where she'd taken that humiliating spill a week ago. Her knee still ached, a dull throb that matched the one in her chest. At 74, she'd started to accept the decline, thinning hair, brittle nails, a mind that wandered off like a lost child. But that flyer, with its bold claim about kelp, had planted a seed of doubt. Could something so ordinary, something she'd ignored her whole life, have stopped this slide before it got so bad? She smoothed the paper out, squinting at the tiny print. The ocean's secret weapon, it said. Ruth snorted. Sounds like a scam. But she couldn't let it go. The next morning, she drove her creaky Subaru into Newport, the coastal fog curling around the windshield like smoke. The town library sat squat and gray against the cliffs, its windows streaked with salt spray. Ruth shuffled inside, past the familiar smell of old books and lemon polish, and made a beeline for the magazine rack. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, something, anything, about kelp. Her fingers, shaky but determined, landed on a dog-eared copy of a health magazine. She flipped through it, past articles on yoga and kale smoothies, until a headline stopped her cold. Kelp, the superfood you're walking past. She sank into a chair, the vinyl creaking under her, and started reading. The words hit her like a wave. Secret 1. Kelp was loaded with iodine, a mineral her thyroid needed to keep her energy up. The Thyroid Foundation said low iodine could explain her exhaustion, the hair falling out in clumps, the cold that never left her bones. Ruth touched her scalp, wincing at the bare patches. She'd lived by the ocean her whole life. How had she missed this? Secret 2. Kelp had something called fucoidan, a compound the National Institutes of Health said fought inflammation. Her knees, her hips, the way they screamed every morning, could that have been quieter if she'd known? She shifted in the chair, feeling the stiffness mock her. Secret 3. Kelp was packed with calcium and vitamin K, stuff the Osteoporosis Foundation swore kept bones strong. Ruth's mind flashed to that stumble on the beach, the way her legs gave out like wet paper. She could have broken something, her hip, her wrist, and ended up in a hospital bed instead of her own. And Secret 4, the big one. Kelp had DHA, a fatty acid tied to brain health, according to Alzheimer's research. Ruth's breath caught. She'd forgotten her neighbor's dog's name last week, Buster. It was Buster, and panicked for hours, thinking it was gone forever. Could Kelp have sharpened her mind, kept those names, those memories, from slipping through her fingers? She sat back, stunned. For secrets, right there in black and white, backed by science she couldn't argue with. And the kicker? Kelp grew wild on her beach, dark, slippery strands she'd kicked aside 1,000 times, never knowing they held the keys to the energy, strength, and clarity she'd lost. I wish I'd known before 72, she whispered, her voice cracking. Before the hairbrush filled up with strands. Before her knees turned traitor. Before her mind started playing hide and seek with the past. Ruth wasn't sold yet, though. Reading was one thing, doing something about it was another. She stopped by the co-op on her way home, the little organic store with its bins of grains and jars of spices. There it was, dried kelp, in a crinkly bag next to the seaweed snacks. $5. She grabbed it, feeling ridiculous, and drove back to her cottage. That night, she stood over her stove, the smell of broth bubbling up as she tossed in a handful of the stuff. It looked like soggy shoelaces, smelled like low tide, and when she took a sip of the soup, she gagged. "This is supposed to save me?" she muttered, forcing it down. But she finished the bowl, stubbornness, maybe, or a flicker of hope. The next few days were a blur of doubt. She sprinkled kelp on her oatmeal, choked down more soup, even chewed a piece raw, wincing at the salty bite. She didn't feel different, not at first. Her knees still creaked. Her hair didn't grow back overnight. "What am I even doing?" she grumbled, ready to toss the bag into the trash. But then, on day 5, something happened. She was washing dishes, the suds warm against her hands, when a name popped into her head: Tommy Grayson. A kid from her last class, 20 years ago, freckles, gapped teeth, always losing his pencils. She'd forgotten him completely, couldn't pull his face from the fog no matter how hard she tried. Until now. Ruth froze, the sponge dripping onto the counter. "Tommy," she said aloud, testing it. Clear as day. She laughed, a sharp, surprised bark that echoed in the tiny kitchen. Was it the kelp? The magazine said DHA helped memory, but so soon? She didn't know, couldn't be sure, but it lit a spark. She dug out that bag of kelp again, stared at it like it was a puzzle piece she'd finally found. Maybe, she thought, maybe there's something here. Hey, let's pause for a second. If you're with me this far, drop a 2 in the comments below and tell me. Have you ever tried kelp? Or is there a superfood you wish you'd known about sooner? I'm dying to hear your stories. Hit me up down there, because Ruth's just getting started, and I bet you've got some wisdom to share too. That night, Ruth stood on her porch, the waves crashing in the dark. The wind stung her cheeks, but she didn't mind. She thought about those 4 secrets: iodine for her thyroid, fucoidan for her joints, calcium for her bones, DHA for her brain. She pictured herself at 72, still walking that beach, still baking cookies for Ellen's kids, still remembering every name in her old class roster. "I could have had that," she said to the ocean, her voice swallowed by the roar. She'd lived beside kelp her whole life, stepped over it, ignored it, while it held answers she didn't know she needed. The regret stung deeper than the wind. But regret wasn't the end. That memory of Tommy Grayson, it was a crack in the dam, a hint of what might still be possible. Ruth wasn't 72 anymore, but she wasn't dead either. She clutched the railing, her nails chipped but steady, and made a quiet promise. "I'm not done yet," she told the sea. I wish I'd known then, but I know now. 4 kelp secrets, washed up on her shore, waiting for her to claim them. She didn't have a time machine, but she had tomorrow, and that was enough to start. The question lingered as she turned back inside, the salt air clinging to her sweater. If you could turn back the clock, what would you do differently for your health? Ruth was about to find out what those secrets could do, not just for the past she'd lost, but for the future she could still fight for. And maybe, just maybe, you're wondering the same thing right now. Ruth Delaney woke to the sound of gulls screaming over the Oregon coast, their cries sharp against the steady crash of waves. It was 6 a.m., earlier than she'd risen in years, but the alarm clock wasn't what pulled her out of bed. It was the kelp. 3 months had passed since she'd choked down that first bowl of salty soup, since Tommy Grayson's name popped into her head like a long-lost friend. 3 months of stubborn grit, of turning that bag of dried seaweed into a lifeline. At 74, Ruth wasn't just surviving anymore, she was clawing her way back to the woman she'd been before 72, before the fog and the frailty stole her spark. And damn if it didn't feel good. It hadn't been easy. The first week, she'd gagged on every bite: kelp in her oatmeal, kelp in her broth, kelp sprinkled over a sad little salad. It tasted like the ocean's armpit, briny and tough, and her stomach revolted. But Ruth was a teacher at heart, patient, persistent, the kind who'd coax a shy kid through multiplication tables until they got it. She kept at it. By week 2, she'd figured out tricks: a dash of soy sauce in the soup, a blender for a kelp smoothie with apple and ginger to mask the funk. She even started chewing the dried stuff raw, a salty crunch she'd chase with a glass of lemon water. If this doesn't kill me, it better work, she'd mutter, half laughing at her own stubbornness. And it did work, slowly, then all at once. The first sign was her hair. She'd run her fingers through it one morning, expecting the usual handful of strands, but there was less. A lot less. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, tilting her head under the weak light. The bald patches weren't gone, but they were smaller, fuzzier, like grass sprouting after a long winter. The thyroid foundation was right. Iodine from kelp was waking up her sluggish thyroid, pumping life back into her scalp. Her nails followed suit. They stopped snapping like dry twigs. She could tap them on the table and hear a solid click. Well, I'll be damned, she whispered, a grin tugging at her lips. Then came her joints. The National Institutes of Health had pegged fucoidan as an inflammation fighter, and Ruth felt it. Her knees, once gritty with pain, started to quiet down. She could climb the porch steps without wincing, bend to pick up a dropped spoon without cursing. It wasn't perfect, she wasn't 50 again, but it was enough to make her wonder, what if I'd started this at 72? Her bones, too, felt steadier. The Osteoporosis Foundation said kelp's calcium and vitamin K built strength, and Ruth believed it. She hadn't stumbled since that day on the beach, hadn't felt that sick dread of a fall. But the real magic was her mind. Alzheimer's research wasn't kidding about DHA, kelp's brain food. After Tommy Grayson, the memories kept coming. She'd be stirring a pot of soup and suddenly recall Mrs. Larson, the principal who'd sneak her extra chalk, or little Susie Pham, who'd drawn her a lopsided heart on the last day of school. One night, she sat down with an old class photo from 20 years back, faded and curled at the edges. She named every kid 30 faces, 30 names without a hitch. Ruth laughed until tears streaked her cheeks, the kind of tears that come from joy, not loss. I've still got it, she said to the empty room, her voice steady. The high tide came on a crisp Saturday morning, 3 months in. Ruth laced up her sneakers, worn but trusty, and grabbed a canvas bag. She'd run out of dried kelp from the co-op, but the beach was calling. She stepped onto the sand, the wind whipping her sweater, and walked. Not shuffled, not hobbled, walked. The tide was out, the shore a mess of rocks and seaweed, and Ruth kept going. 1 mile, then 2. Her breath came steady, her knees held firm, her heart thumped like it remembered how to live. She stopped at a pile of fresh kelp, dark and glistening, and bent to pick it up. No wobble, no fear. Her hands, stronger now, stuffed it into the bag. She straightened up, the ocean stretching endless before her, and laughed a wild, free sound that mingled with the waves. That night, she cooked with it fresh kelp, rinsed and chopped, simmered into a stew with potatoes and a splash of cream. It didn't taste like the ocean's armpit anymore, it tasted like victory. She ate on the porch, the sun dipping low, painting the water gold. A gull swooped overhead, and Ruth raised her spoon to it. "Here's to you," she said, grinning. She wasn't just eating, she was claiming back the years she'd lost. The next week, she took it further. At her book club, 6 gray-haired ladies who met at the library every month, Ruth brought a surprise. Not cookies, not yet, but a thermos of kelp soup and a little list she'd typed up on her ancient computer. "For kelp secrets I wish I'd known before 72. She poured cups for them, ignoring their raised eyebrows, and read it aloud. 1. Iodine for your thyroid keeps your hair and energy up. 2. Fucoidan for inflammation eases the aches. 3. Calcium and K for your bones keeps you standing tall. 4. DHA for your brain brings the past back." They sipped, they winced, they listened. By the end, old Mrs. Carter was nodding. "My hands don't hurt as much lately," she admitted. Ruth beamed. "Told you." The real climax came a month later. Ellen called, begging her to visit. "The kids miss you, Mom. Come bake with them." Ruth hadn't baked in years, her hands too weak, her spirit too low. But now, she packed a bag, drove the hour to Portland, and walked into her daughter's kitchen. The grandkids, Lila, 8, and Max, 6, swarmed her, tugging at her sweater. "Cookies, Grandma," they shouted. Ruth smiled, a real smile, and pulled out a twist, kelp powder she'd ground herself. She mixed it into the dough, oats, chocolate chips, a pinch of sea magic, and they baked. The kitchen smelled warm and sweet, the kelp a subtle undertone no one noticed. Lila took a bite, grinned. "You're the best, Grandma." Ruth's eyes stung. She was back. That night, standing in Ellen's backyard, Ruth looked at the stars over the city. She wasn't 72 anymore, but she wasn't done either. Kelp hadn't turned back time, it couldn't erase the wrinkles or the years, but it had given her something better, a second wind. Her hair was thicker, her nails solid, her joints quieter, her mind alive. She wished she'd known at 72, before the fall, before the fog. But knowing now, that was enough. Here's the truth. Ruth's story isn't just hers. It's yours too. 4 kelp secrets: iodine, fucoidan, calcium, DHA hid in plain sight, waiting to lift her up. They're not magic pills, but they're real, backed by science, sitting on shores and in stores right now. Ruth waited till 74 to find them. Don't you wait that long. Start with a spoonful in your soup, a sprinkle on your salad. Feel your thyroid hum, your joints ease, your bones hold, your memories sharpen. Don't let 72 be your regret line. Ruth's living proof. It's never too late, but it's always better early. So here's my challenge. Don't wish, act. Pick one secret, try kelp tomorrow. Maybe it's a smoothie, maybe it's a stew. Whatever it is, make it yours. Because Ruth didn't just find health, she found the years she thought were gone. The question's yours now. What are you waiting for to take your future back? Ruth stopped waiting. You can too.